Hi everybody, my name is Amy and welcome to my channel. Today we are taking a look at how to draw grey fur. So if this is something that you struggle with, then carry on watching today's video. So let's start with the basics. So I am using the Faber Castell polychromos pencils, and I'm using around 8 pencils for this fur study, ranging from the cold grey 1, 2 and 6, the warm grey 3, 5 and 6, the silver and the white pencil from the luminance set. And I've picked these colours because they give a good enough range for all of the lovely tones that you will see in grey fur. So as I am drawing curly fur for this demonstration, I like to just start out by mapping out the shape of the fur, and to do this I am using the warm grey 6. So for this tutorial I'm not going to be delving too much into the type of fur I am drawing, but I do have a new tutorial series coming out on how to draw a whole range of different types of fur. I just find it a lot easier to map out the shape of the fur clumps and the direction of the fur, just so that I can quickly establish and identify all of the shadows and the light and dark tones in the fur. And the reason why I've chosen the warm grey 6 is because it's quite a dark colour, so that means that I'm able to just easily identify all of the main details in the fur. And then what I like to do is just fill in the fur with loads of different grey tones to build on the layers and those grey tone values. At this stage I'm also identifying all of the darker clumps of fur, but also where the fur is quite light. So to do that I look at the reference photo, and I just find it really helps just to look at all the colours in the fur. The thing I love about grey fur is its simplicity. So there's not loads and loads of colours in the fur like brown or ginger fur. It's just more about getting in the right values rather than just adding in loads and loads of colour. So grey fur is just really made up of grey tones. So although I'm using a few different grey tones and I'm just going from the lighter greys to the darker greys, they're all pretty similar. So that just helps just to break down the fur colours a lot better. So I personally feel that grey fur is just like graphite pencils, so you don't have to worry too much about the colours, and graphite pencils just takes away all of that pressure of actually using colours. So it's really good just for helping you to really look at the values and look more at the contrast, look more at the dimension and the depth in the fur, rather than worrying about all of those tones and those hues and colours in the fur. So if you are drawing a coloured fur, like say brown or ginger fur, then you're going to have to spend some time just really picking out all of the different colours for the fur. But with grey fur, it's all pretty much colours from one range, so light greys, mid greys and then dark greys. So when I am drawing grey fur, there are 4 key things that I'm really focusing on. So the first thing is the shading. So what I do is I'm looking at where there needs to be a lot more shading. So shading comes in handy, say if I had areas of really clumped together fur, then I'd apply a lot of shading in those areas because the fur is closer together, so it appears darker and more shaded. So what I'll do is I will apply more shading to those areas, and that's what I really focus on as one main point. The next thing I focus on is the tone. So what I'll do is it's very similar to the shading. So for the tone, I like to just build up on the light, mid and dark values in the fur. So what I'll do is I'll look at the tonality in the grey fur. So I'll look at where there's those light tones and where the highlights are. I'll look at where the light tones then transition into mid-tones, and I'll obviously include some mid-tone values as well. And then I will look at the darker tones in the grey fur. So the third point that I also focus on is literally just what I just talked about, so going into the values. So tone and value is very, very similar. Tone is more about the light, mid and dark, so it's about base tones, it's about undertones. Values is more about getting in that contrast, so building up on those tones and then really defining those values. And when I talk about values, I mainly talk about the dark values. So I'll look at sections of the grey fur that appear really, really dark, and it's really important to have the darker aspects of grey fur, because obviously grey fur can sort of look like all one colour, so to separate it out out a little bit and just give it more of a value to it, what I'll do is I'll include a lot more darker tones in the grey fur. What I really like to do with grey fur, and I really do this for all of my fur studies, is I will build up from light to dark. And it's so important to do this because you need to make sure that you focus obviously on the tone, the values, the shading and the detailing. And to get all of those 4 core things into grey fur, you really need to build up from light to dark. So by building up from light to dark, what this is going to do is it's going to help you first of all to get in those undertones, so those really light areas where they're going to show through the darker areas. But also lighter tones are really important because what they do is they act as highlights as well, and they help you to preserve those highlights. So when you go in at the end and you're rendering the fur, you've got to make sure that you do have those light areas to pull up those highlights. If you also gradually build up from the light areas to the dark, then what you should do is you should see this gradual sort of increase going from light to dark. So when I go from light to dark fur, what I'll do is I'll just really gradually start to darken the pencil. So say I had an area of really light fur and then it went quite dark, what I would do is I'd use a really light grey pencil, so say the cold grey 1, and then I'd go up to a cold grey 2 and then a cold grey 3, all the way up to say a cold grey 6, so that it just gradually gets darker and darker, and there's not really that just instant change and too much contrast going on with the fur. Because too much contrast means that you're going to have the fur looking really unnatural and really unrealistic. Fur is really soft, it is really subtle, so you don't want to have one area really dark and then it contrasts in with a really light area. You've got to have that subtle transition of tone. So I use light grey tones for the lighter fur, so any areas of fur that maybe the undertones are showing through, any areas of fur that are highlighted or really bright, I'll use light grey tones for. For mid-grey tones, so they're used for the transition from the light to the dark, so I'll start to use some mid-toned greys. So for example, the cold grey 3 or the warm grey 3, they're great colours to use for mid-tones because they're sort of in between the lightest and the darkest grey tones, and the mid-grey tones are really important because they act as that sort of transition from the light to the dark. And like I said, it just helps just to make sure that you don't have too much contrast going on in the fur. Then for the dark greys, I use the darker greys for the darker fur, and darker fur is really important. Like I said, you need to have those darker values to make that fur really stand out and just to make that fur really pop. And also I use the darker greys for the shadowed parts of the fur. So any fur that is in the dark, I'll use the darker greys just to really enhance those shadows and all of those values. Grey fur is also great because it's very similar to white fur. It's just obviously more tone, more shading, more darker values, but it's very soft and it's very subtle. And grey fur is also great for blending well with white. So I actually find it the easiest to be able to pull up highlights in grey fur. So if I'm trying to pull up highlights in black fur, I can find this quite hard if I haven't preserved those areas. And grey fur is actually more forgiving, and grey fur actually works really well with white, so quite often I'll use white in with grey, or I use grey in with white. So it's actually really easy for me to use white pencils over grey fur, and I just find that it just blends in really well. So then obviously we have the warm and cool grey tones. So I use a lot of warm and cool grey tones in black fur, and again we have the same thing with grey fur. So there's actually variations in grey tones. So we have the cold grey tones and we have the warm grey tones, and I actually did use both for this drawing. So the cold grey tones actually have a lot of blue tinge to them, so when you lay it down you'll see a little bit of like a blue tinge to the cold grey tones. So they're very blue, they're very cold, and they're much duller. Whereas with the warm grey tones have a yellow and brown hue to them. So they appear a lot warmer and obviously more richer in colour. And the reason why I used both of the warm and cool grey tones is just because I didn't want to have warm grey tones or cool grey tones where the fur started to look either really brown or really blue. So using both just balances out all the hues in the grey fur. But again, it really is just all about the genetics of the animal, where the animal is, the light source, as to what sort of tones you're going to see in that grey fur. But just a general rule of thumb, you're going to see normally either grey, warm grey or cold grey tones in the fur. But anyway guys, I think that just about finishes off this tutorial today, so I really hope these pointers gave you a lot of helpful tips and ideas for drawing grey fur. If you are new around here, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so that you never miss an update from me. This channel is home to all things arty related, and I upload videos 3 times a week, plus live streams as well, so you're going to be joining in on all the fun if you subscribe to my channel. And as I said, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye guys!